The decision hour is upon us. On Tuesday, Iran approached a U.S. carrier with a Shahed drone, the same class that routinely strikes Ukraine, only for an F-35 to shoot it down. It is unclear whether Iran was using the Shahed for surveillance or a potential strike. That same day, two Iranian gunboats approached the Stena Imperative, a U.S.-flagged chemical tanker that was sitting in international waters. They ordered the tanker to stop and to prepare to be boarded. The USS McFall came in to make the save, scurrying the Iranian gunboats away and escorting the Stena Imperative to safer waters. All of this is happening in the shadow of diplomatic talks scheduled for Friday, somewhere in the Middle East. They are still debating on that point. Regardless, the bigger picture here is that the United States has placed the assets that it needs near the Persian Gulf, and soon the White House will have to decide what real action, if any, it wants to take in Iran. However, the whole situation is full of public misunderstandings, ranging from a belief that this is another obvious Trump bluff to the frankly more baffling connection to Iran's nuclear program. So today, let's discuss what is happening with the US military deployments and what it means for the broader war versus negotiation situation. We should begin with the US allotment. And I want to speak in generalities here. One, because of the whole fog of war problem of trying to know exactly what is happening. And two, because my purpose in life is to explain the political importance of the moves, rather than the precise tactical points that the Pentagon might be planning. The main headline is that the Lincoln Strike Group is now situated within, well, striking distance of Iran. That includes the host of assets aboard the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier itself, plus 3 destroyers riding alongside it, plus the other naval assets added to the area, like the aforementioned USS McFall. Presumably on board those destroyers are plenty of Tomahawk missiles. Usually I would comment here about the conniptions that Indo-PACOM will have if those Tomahawks are used in the Middle East rather than to deter China. But it is 2026, so I can also add a comment here about half of Europe having conniptions that they are not being used against Russia. Isn't the world today so much fun? Anyway, beyond the Lincoln and her naval friends, you have F-15E fighters getting situated in Jordan, refueling tankers and air defense systems stationed at the main US base in Qatar, surveillance aircraft all over the region, search and rescue aircraft all over the region, plus rumors of cargo planes that may hold Patriots and the like to protect against heavier missiles that Iran might fire at US assets and allies. Now, I can safely tell you that this is not the United States situating itself to repeat the Iraq War in either form, 2003 or 1991. That would require a large number of soldiers to set up nearby, which is not happening and would be impossible for the United States to hide. But this is reminiscent of Venezuela. You remember that operation from a whole month ago? It was a lot of metal to be putting in the region if the White House was not serious about the situation. And indeed, the White House was serious about the situation. Back near Iran, all of those deployments cost money, and removing the Lincoln from the Indo-Pacific region has created some vulnerability there at a time when China seems to be poking Taiwan at increasingly aggressive and record-setting rates. Part of the public misperception here is not understanding the lack of action weeks ago, when public unrest in Iran was at its highest. I suppose there was a conventional wisdom that the United States could snap its fingers and magically rain down bombs, similar to how last summer's strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities played out. And while it is true that the B-2 bombers did magically transport themselves over there within a day, the rest of the strike package had to strategically set up shop in the days beforehand. Fast forwarding to the peak of the protests, the United States had shifted its assets to South America, leaving insufficient tools to strike weeks ago. The key point here is that the absence of the United States taking action, when action was impossible to take, should not be informative of whether the United States will take action now that it has gone to great lengths to prepare for such. I think that there is an interesting sociological point here, in that the leading social media narrative today is that Iran is a clear taco situation, whereas the leading social media narrative of 2 weeks ago was that Trump was surely about to invade Greenland. Subtle reminder to not listen to what leaders say, but rather watch what they do. Trump yapped a bunch about Greenland, but was light on real action, whereas the United States is committing a ton to the Persian Gulf right now. Point is, for Greenland, I urged everyone to head down to the Winchester, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all of that to blow over. I do not recommend the same for Iran. Now, that does not mean that a war between the United States and Iran is inevitable. Just that the Trump administration is serious about the matter, and some form of conflict is likely absent credible concessions from Iran. So let's try to sort the rest of that out. Broadly speaking, there are two perspectives that we could take here. One is that the credible commitment issues are insurmountable, and so negotiations are doomed to fail. Option two is the opposite. Let's start with the more kinetically interesting one. Rewind a second. In the counterfactual world where the United States had all of the puzzle pieces in the region weeks ago, US strikes would have seemed inevitable. With protesters outnumbering security forces on the streets, the White House would have faced a clear closing window of opportunity. You could make a play at removing the Ayatollah, giving the protesters the heavy metal support that they lacked. Or you could have tried to broker a deal with Iran. The trouble with the latter option is that once the protests ended, the regime would not have incentive to follow through on concessions given that the threat was gone. Internalizing the Ayatollah's credible commitment problem, the United States would ignore any Iranian promises and fight instead. However, that is not the world that we live in. Thanks to Maduro, the United States did not have the proper assets in the region, and it appears that most of the protesting has now stopped. There is nothing to hit to support active protesting at this point, and it is unclear to what end ordering a retaliatory strike would serve, other than to spike oil prices. Now, to be sure, the domestic threat to the Islamic Republic of Iran is still present. To wit, the internet blackout meant to prevent protesters from coordinating has only been relaxed. It has not ended. Indeed, here is what happens when you try accessing the Ayatollah's official website. About 2 weeks ago, though, some government-approved websites became available. Since then, citizens and protesters have been playing cat-and-mouse games with VPNs, and the government remains very concerned about coordination over social media. Consequently, there also remains some chance that the United States will adopt a "if you build it, they will come" strategy of bombing security forces stations, hoping that protesters will re-emerge on the streets and then topple the Ayatollah. A slightly less kinetic alternative would be to set up a quarantine around the Persian Gulf to halt the export of Iranian oil. Yep, shades of Venezuela once again. Note that it would be a quarantine and not a blockade, because as Marco Rubio was careful to remind any senator who went down the wrong path during his recent congressional testimony, a blockade is an act of war, and the United States certainly would not be engaged in acts of war. Anyway, this would not be too difficult in principle, because most of Iran's seabound energy exports exit via the Strait of Hormuz, which is a relatively narrow path. The strategy would serve three purposes. 1. It is a tangible message to Iranians that the United States is there and ready to take action, unlike a few weeks ago. 2. This would really start to squeeze the government coffers. Remember, the reason that the government faced an uprising in the first place was due to an inability to provide basic services like water and electricity, things that cost money. If security forces start wondering if they will receive their next paychecks, then you may start to not have security forces at all. 3. China is the main direct beneficiary, and sometimes virtually the only direct beneficiary, of Iranian oil exports. So you might start seeing Beijing apply political pressure on Tehran to concede on more issues to end the crisis. The primary downside here is that it would spike oil prices globally. If China's supply from Iran disappears, then China will start to purchase from the wider market, leading to higher prices at the pump even in the United States. There is a deeper risk that Iran will take a more serious approach than the Stena Imperative situation and try to fully disrupt non-Iranian tankers heading through the strait. I have spent 90 minutes discussing this possibility before. Suffice it to say that it would be hard for Iran to do, but extremely costly for everyone if it happened, regardless of the outcome. Previously, we had framed the situation there as Iran being the instigator. It would be interesting to watch the tables turn. Finally, the remaining concern here is that China gets fed up with the entire situation and starts taking coercive measures against the United States. But that is another complicated thought best reserved for another time. For now, the important thing to take away from this is that the naval domain is the United States' strong suit, so it is something to keep an eye on. Switching gears, the opposite perspective is that the window for protests is unlikely to open again, and so the United States would rather strike a temporary bargain than tempt fate. The emphasis there is on temporary, because it will be hard to force Iran to commit to any concessions made after the revolutionary threat has completely dissipated. Now, all of the discussion on that point has been geared toward Iran's nuclear program. In fact, Iran says that it is the only thing up for negotiations on Friday. If you think that connecting the two situations is weird, I agree that it is hard to explain on the surface. But let's dig a bit deeper. There are two things worth noting here. One, following the strike last June, the White House claimed that Iran's, quote, key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Skeptics pointed out that it was impossible to know that at the time, and the fact that there are meaningful nuclear negotiations to have today is a clear indication that many sites or resources, perhaps specifically Iran's supply of highly enriched uranium, survived. The second thing worth noting is that it makes sense to negotiate on this dimension. If Iran were to build a nuclear weapon in the future, the Ayatollah would have increased bargaining power. Right now, however, the United States is enjoying the increased bargaining power from the risk of further protests. Maybe you can see how these two cancel out. As I mentioned earlier, the problem with negotiating in the shadow of a power shift is that the rising state will not want to follow through on its commitments after its shift is complete. Well, usually we are thinking about negotiations on the substantive dimensions when we talk about this. Back in Ukraine, that is usually focused on territory. Over in Iran, it is political influence in the Middle East. But rather than think about substantive negotiations, you could negotiate on the power itself here. The United States does not attack Iran right now, despite its enhanced capacity to do so. In return, though, Iran must undermine its future military capacity. This effectively smooths the power shift, and will help with long-run negotiations regarding the substantive disagreements between the parties. The reason that this is potentially credible is that Iran will have to reconstruct anything that it destroys as a product of these negotiations, be it the facilities themselves or the stockpile of highly enriched uranium. It will remain possible for Iran to revisit a nuclear program later, of course. However, Iran will take longer and spend more to obtain a bomb, which indeed has the effect of reducing Iran's future bargaining power. The goal here would not be a fully credible end of Iran's nuclear future, or at least that is not an obtainable goal. It is just to build another inconvenience in the system that will sway Iran's decision-making to some degree, or at least that is what I figured out a decade ago when all of this was theoretical. Yeah, people forget that I was a nuclear person first and foremost who got sidetracked in Ukraine. I did not think that it was going to be a 3-day special military operation, but I am surprised to still be doing this 4 years later. Anyway, trying to mitigate power shifts by shifting power the opposite direction is a common tactic. In fact, it is happening over along the Taiwan Strait right now. It is even setting up the possibility of a Taiwan missile crisis, which is somehow evading widespread news coverage. But that is a topic for another time. For now, if you want to learn more about a potential disaster that could come out of the Strait of Hormuz, and you do not mind listening to my voice for a feature-length period of time, check out that video on a potential shutdown, and not of the government variety in the United States. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.